Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by BetDSI. Hey, you looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? BetDSI is the industry leader in football betting and the perfect sportsbook for both novice and professional bettors alike. New members get a 100% bonus match when you use the promo code SEATS100. Yeah, that's SEATS100 at betdsi.com. That's more than double your money to help start winning today. Once again, betdsi.com, promo code SEATS100, and get your limited time 100% bonus offer when you deposit today. Now, here's our show.
So, Wes Unseld, who in 1971 failed as the center of the Baltimore Bullets when they were blown out by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks in 4 straight games, and who failed again in 1975 when the Golden State Warriors beat the Washington Bullets by 4 straight, is just 12 ticks of the clock away from his first NBA championship. Paul Silas will take the ball out of bounds. It's been a whale of a campaign, and the tired looks now starting to show on even the fans' faces. It began 8 months ago. Dennis Johnson begins the countdown. They must shoot quickly. It is in and out. Unseld with control. It is about to end. Bobby Dandridge, he will be our most valuable player. Bobby Dandridge voted the CBS most valuable player here in the NBA Championship Series, and the celebration can begin in Washington. Dick Motta and Bernie Bickerstaff are embracing over there as the Washington Bullets jubilantly file off the floor, and the crowd here in Seattle, rather than booing, comes to its feet and gives both these teams a tremendous ovation. Freddie Brown and Wes Unseld shaking hands at midcourt, and it was the Washington Bullets prevailing 105-99, the final score, as they file into their locker room. The commissioner of the NBA, Lawrence O'Brien, is here with some special guests, and Commissioner, why don't you present this trophy?
This is one of the great series of all time in the NBA. And it was played right down to the wire, and we can all be proud of the Supersonics, of course, tonight. And I'm very happy to be here with Jerry Sachs, Bob Ferry, our coach, Dick Motta, and Wes Unseld, who has been waiting a while for all of this.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and you have stumbled across, perhaps mistakenly so, well, hopefully not, the little podcast we like to call Good Seats Still Available. It's our little curious journey we like to do for you each and every week, devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming by. And boy, oh boy, we have a ton of forgotten sports memories to cram into this one little episode, as we delve into the very surprising and very deeply rich, and frankly, a lot of it unbeknownst to yours truly, pro basketball history of the city of Washington, D.C. Our guest this week is Brett Abrams. He's the co-author, along with Rafael Mazzone, of a book called The Bullets, the Wizards, and Washington, D.C. Basketball, and it is a tour de force. It's a history, a little walk through the history of the professional game in Washington, D.C., a whole bunch of which I didn't even know about. Now, most people certainly know the Washington Wizards of today, of course, and maybe a good chunk of folks out there listening to this show know that they were known as the Washington Bullets prior to their name change in the mid-1990s. We get into the reasons why in our conversation with Brett in a little while. But the Bullets really kind of synonymized themselves with Washington in the 1970s for sure, when they won their big 1978 NBA championship, Washington, D.C.'s first real substantial professional sports franchise victory championship there in many, many years. But the Bullets were obviously, or maybe not known to a lot of people, actually domiciled in Baltimore for many years prior to them moving to D.C. We get into the story of why that occurred and how and when that occurred. But I'm willing to bet that most people listening to this show don't even know this little factoid, as I kind of just discovered. Before they were in the Baltimore Bullets in 1963, they began their life in the NBA as the Chicago Packers. In 1961, renamed the Chicago Zephyrs in 1962, moving to Baltimore in 63. I didn't know that. Fascinating stuff. But yes, the Washington Wizards can dialed their history all the way back to the 1961 Chicago Packers team. And we get into all of that sort of discussion and that sort of history in our conversation. But that's not all, folks. No. We're just kind of getting warmed up because we can go way back. The history of pro basketball dates all the way back to the owner, more well-known as the owner of the Washington Now football team. We're not going to sort of reference its name. But the Palace Five, probably one of the original pro basketball teams, George Preston Marshall was the founder of that, and they played in a little place called the Uline Arena in the center of the city there. And that begot about a dozen or 2 years later, Red Auerbach, that name from the Boston Celtics. Well, he kind of got his start with a little team in the American Basketball League called the Washington Capitals, with an O, Capitals. And the Uline Arena, for you folks in the D.C. area, may know that better now as the flagship store of REI in downtown Washington, D.C. Yeah, that used to be the Uline Arena where the Palace Five and the Washington Capitals and even the Washington Tapers of the ill-fated and very short-lived American Basketball League of Abe Saperstein. We've talked about that a little bit with some previous teams like the George Steinbrenner Cleveland Pipers were part of that league. And there's a fascinating little tale there. And yeah, that was Abe Saperstein's little promotional effort to kind of move on from the Harlem Globetrotters and the barnstorming model into an actual challenger professional league of the NBA, the fledgling NBA at that point, 1961-62. And a guy named Earl Foreman comes into the scene. He's the guy who was sort of instrumental, along with Abe Pollin, buying that franchise from Chicago and bringing them the Bullets to Baltimore. But once that went sour for Earl Foreman, by the way, reminder, the co-founder of the Major Indoor Soccer League, hint, see or listen to our conversation with the great Ed Tepper about that. Earl Foreman got bought out by Abe Pollin and the Baltimore Bullets and decided he was going to create a team in Washington, D.C. proper, a rebooted Washington Capitals, known as the Caps, actually, in the ABA, the American Basketball Association. They only lasted a season. But Earl Foreman was thinking, hey, maybe I could get my hands on the Washington, D.C. market if and when the ABA and the NBA merge. It ultimately happened years later. He had to move to Virginia to become the Squires with the ABA, and it didn't sort of work out that well for Earl Foreman in that regard. The Squires did not get absorbed into the NBA, but Abe Pollin did indeed, and some would say was part of forcing Earl Foreman out of D.C. He essentially extended his regional rights, if you will, and moving Baltimore to Washington, D.C. They became the Capital Bullets for a season, if you can believe that. And then they ultimately became the Washington Bullets in, I think it was 74. And that's where they lasted until becoming the Wizards in the mid-90s. But all of that stuff is just, it's all kinds of twists and turns. Washington, D.C., professional basketball. Who knew? Not only all these names and twists and turns, but we get into all of that and more with our guest again this week, Brett Abrams, as we talk Washington, D.C. pro hoops. Fascinating stuff, great book, and intrigue all around in just a few moments' time. A couple of promotional notes, he says. Let's get into a few places where you can perhaps scratch that Washington professional basketball itch. Let's see, in no particular order, how about our pals at reboundvintagehoops.com? Reboundvintagehoops.com for all kinds of great promotional t-shirt items in the realm of basketball. And if you want to remember the Washington Tapers of the old American Basketball League, they began, by the way, we'll talk about it. They played in the Washington Coliseum. They relocated in the middle of the season to Long Island to become the New York Tapers. And then the season after that, for the half season that was left of the ABL, they moved to Philadelphia. So only a brief amount of time that they were in Washington. But when they were known as the Washington Tapers, you can find that logo on a mug, a T-shirt, a sweatshirt, whatever, at reboundvintagehoops.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS, and you'll get 10% off all of your purchases, including any of that Washington Tapers stuff that you might like. And there's lots of great teams from various professional basketball leagues for you there. Again, at reboundvintagehoops.com, promo code GOODSEATS, 10% off your Washington Tapers gear and other stuff too. But let's say you want to remember the Washington Caps, the ABA team that was there for a season. There are two great shirts for you at our pals at streakersports.com. Streakersports.com, the purveyors of sports culture, and the promo code for you there is GOODSEATS. And we've got a 10%, no, not 10%, 15% discount for you there. Again, promo code GOODSEATS at streakersports.com. And they've got two great shirts, two great logo treatments for the 1969-70 one-year season of the Washington Caps for you to obsess about, choose, and enjoy. So check them out, streakersports.com, promo code GOODSEATS. And last but not least, let's say not only were you a Caps fan, but you want to go deeper, and you want to truly commemorate and show your friends that you not only remembered the Washington Caps ABA franchise, but you can't let go, and you want to go that level beyond. Well, how about a custom made with your name on the back of it, if you'd like, Washington Caps retro jersey. Oh yeah. Either in yellow with green trim and green lettering and numerals, or perhaps maybe you like to have that green, that forest green color with the yellow trim and yellow numbers and letters that says Caps on it in both cases. Well, that's our friends at Royal Retros that can help you out there. RoyalRetros.com. And not only will you find jerseys from the Washington Caps, but all kinds of ABA teams. How about the Houston Mavericks, or the Anaheim Amigos, or maybe the San Diego Sails, or how about even the Virginia Squires, where the Washington Caps moved to? Maybe even the Oakland Oaks, the team that actually preceded the Washington Caps. Yeah, that was the franchise, and we talked about it with our pal Pat Boone, the owner of that franchise. That was the franchise after 2 seasons in Oakland that moved to Washington as Earl Foreman bought that franchise and moved it to D.C. Well, you can relive all of that stuff on a daily basis if you want. Just make sure you wash the item. You don't want to stink up the joint, right? You want to keep it nice and clean. And again, that's RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. The promo code for you there is SEATS for 10% off that jersey or any other item that you might like and find at RoyalRetros.com. Again, 10% off for the promo code SEATS at RoyalRetros.com. All right, I think I've exhausted all of those opportunities, but if you're a Washington, D.C. professional hoops fan and you want to go deep and show your understanding and your knowledge, and you want to school your friends, check out those sites and use those promo codes. And please enjoy, courtesy of us and our friends at those various places. Lots of great stuff for you at all of those places and more. And thanks for checking them out. We appreciate it. All right, let's get into our conversation. We're going to get into it now deeply with Brett Abrams. We're going to talk about Washington hoops, all kinds of professional versions and twists and turns. Here's our conversation we had just last week. Please sit back and enjoy. I take it this isn't necessarily your day job, writing books about pro basketball history.
Correct. One sales would be very disappointing if one was relying on putting food on the table for that. What happened is I moved here to Washington and went to school as in history, got a PhD in history, and loved being here. And the city has grown and diversified and become infinitely more exciting. And during that time, it just swept me up. And so my second book is called Capital Sporting Grounds. And what that was about was the fields that existed, don't exist anymore, continue to exist for baseball and football throughout the city. And I talk about the politics of getting them built, and specifically I talk about the reasons behind them. Like, for example, because Washington is the capital, a lot of reasons were for monumental purposes. We were going to have a stadium for Lincoln. We were going to have a stadium for Teddy Roosevelt. This is just to be expected for Washington. I think the most interesting chapter was the one that was devoted to the reasoning for building stadiums, because we were going to host the 2002 Olympics with Baltimore and Alexandria, Virginia. So that got me looking around, and one day I rode what's the Metro, which is the subway system, and looked outside and saw a very strange building. And it's a very cool building. It's called the Uline Arena, and it was named after the guy who built it. It's in the near northeast corridor of Washington. It's where the trains run from when you come into Union Station in Washington, D.C. You pass it. Inevitably, you pass it. And it actually, from that place, you can actually look out and see the nation's Capitol building itself. This fellow who was writing about sports for the local version of the, Village Voice told me that it was an old arena, and it was a coliseum, and it was a place where the Beatles came in 1964, the first place where they played. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So then I looked at the sports aspect of it and found out that an ice maker in the days of the 1930s, a guy who made ice and then provided it to the different businesses and residences around the city, decided that it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a hockey team. So he built one. He built an arena for a hockey team. And that Uline Arena then became this setup for the the second Washington basketball team, which was coached by Red Auerbach, and occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So that's long-winded enough, I figure.
No, that's interesting. So it was the building, and for people who sort of walk by today, I believe it's the flagship store of REI in Washington, D.C., yeah?
Correct, it is. And they did a good job on the historic preservation aspect of it. Both Raphael and I are in the video where they talk about what the building was like before. They use pictures, of course, from the ball games. I mean, it's notable for a variety of different reasons. Most people are attracted to the idea that the Beatles landed there, and after Ed Sullivan, they went down by train and played at what was called the Washington Coliseum at that point in 1964. So that was their opening performance for the first Beatles tour in that era. So that was pretty interesting.
But how did basketball ensnare you then? Because given the roots of it being a hockey arena.
So the hockey arena lasts from 1941 on. It was called the Washington Lions, was the name of the team. And Mci Uline became connected to the group of people that were interested in starting the 1940s basketball league, which was called the Basketball Association of America. And it was going to compete against what was called the National Basketball League, which had one of the most notable players of that era, George Mikan. He was playing, and the National Basketball League was a league that focused mostly on the Rust Belt areas of Indianapolis and Akron and those smaller cities. And so what the basketball group did in the East was form a group of people that would play under the BAA, and that included New York, Chicago, St. Louis, basically the route that was the same structure that was used for the Major League Baseball in that era. So New York, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, and that was really about as far as it went. So Uline got involved with that group of people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so in essence, minor league hockey was the primary reason, but basketball was becoming And we've talked about that in various episodes, right? This was becoming more of a professional thing, that you're talking about the two direct feeder leagues that ultimately became the NBA.
Exactly, the two feeder leagues. And so what was interesting was Auerbach was serving in the Navy in 1942-43, and of course was playing basketball and got to know people like Bones McKinney, who was from North Carolina, and some of these other people that had played college basketball and were now playing semi-pro or were in the Navy themselves. And so he actually got in touch with Uline, and Uline and he formed a team together, and Auerbach brought most of his friends to the team along with himself. And so they were actually pretty strong. They were mostly, I think Brett Auerbach is the most interesting character of all the people that were involved with that Capitals team. But in the third season, that Capitals team played the Minneapolis Lakers with Mikan for the championship of the league. They were that good.
And the rise of basketball around that time, right? I mean, DC, obviously in the Northeast and the Midwest, right, was pretty much the sort of the origins of the pro game, you know, and really in many respects, DC was more than holding its own already. I mean, I think a lot of people sort of, you know, give New York and Philadelphia certainly a lot of props as sort of the early progenitors of the game and quality. But this Washington Capitals team, late 40s, early 1950s, right, seemed to be pretty scrappy, and you couldn't do worse than having a guy like Auerbach, right?
No, in fact, Auerbach's the key player. And as far as the engine that makes the team work, the person who puts the right players out on the court, the person who makes the right trades, the person who negotiates the contracts. Unfortunately, he was going on a 1 year by 1 year basis. And so Uline decided that he didn't want to give him a multiple year contract, and Auerbach walked away. And when Auerbach walked away, a guy named Bob Ferrick became the team's coach. And even though they made the playoffs the next year, the team basically fell from good graces at that point. And by the fifth year, they were actually going to drop out of the league. And they dropped out of the league in 1951.
Yeah, so I think most people don't recognize that when the NBA was finally announced, that merger, if you will, of the BAA and the NBL, Washington Capitals were part of the first ever assemblage of quote-unquote NBA franchises.
Correct. They were, and they were also the first to ever use an African-American player, a guy by the name of Earl Lloyd. So that's kind of fun. And they actually had Bill Sharman on their team. So both Bill Sharman and Earl Lloyd were friends. They both went into military service together because the Korean War breaks out. And so they have to go and put their time into the Army, which, of course, debilitated the Washington Capitals roster, which basically made it almost impossible for the team to play well. And when the team didn't play well, nobody came to see the games. I mean, there's some fascinating stuff about Washington and segregation, which I would like to talk a little bit about with the Uline Arena.
Well, sure. Go ahead. I mean, this is a city, right?
Washington's a segregation.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to talk about DC, right? It's got the best and the worst of both the Northeast and the Southeast, right?
Correct. It does. And so it is segregated. And so black people could not go to basketball games at Uline, but could go to boxing events. I mean, very strange, very, very particular and unique rules. And so during that time, there was a huge hue and cry, as you would expect, and an effective protest that they held on a regular basis outside Uline Arena. And it worked. And so Uline caved and allowed for African Americans to come and see the game of basketball or hockey or whatever else was going on at the arena at that time. And that's a big deal because at that point, Griffith Stadium is segregated, which is the place where the Washington Senators played. So that's also where the Washington Redskins of that old name played. And so that was a segregated place. And the only place where African Americans and white people could meet and mingle would be the public library, which was it was a Carnegie Library that sits in the middle of the city, basically on Palatial, Massachusetts Avenue. So the work, getting Uline to cave and for mixing of African Americans and Caucasians in that 1948 period is a huge breakthrough. And then, of course, it's rather touching that we in Washington have the first African American player in NBA history who ever took the court. So I think that's kind of fun too.
All right. Well, let me stop you there because now I actually want to go back a step, because when you bring up racial segregation and Washington, D.C. and sports, you now hit the tripwire of a guy named George Preston Marshall, right? And I think most of our listeners, from our previous conversations about the Washington football team, its origins, the original ownership, how they came into the NFL. This was a guy who was not shy about his views on segregation. And ironically, or maybe not so, he's actually an integral part of our little conversation today because he was actually part of arguably the first real professional basketball franchise years earlier in D.C.
Right, exactly. The American Basketball League, which was ironically founded by people like George Halas, who was struggling at that point to bring the National Football League into its own. And so it turns out Harris and Marshall become friendly with each other through a guy named Joe Carr, who was also part of the National Football League. And they decided in 1925 that there could be money made out of a national basketball group, and they called it the American Basketball League. And so that starts in the mid-20s. Before that, there were barnstorming teams, especially the New York Celtics, which was a group of people that played basketball and went from place to place and took on the best players of that city and usually beat them. They were key ball handlers. They were great shooters. And so usually they drew crowds of like 2,000 to 3,000 people. They'd set up an arena. The arena would be surrounded by a cage, which I think we have to understand is where the notion of a cager comes from in basketball history. The term is sometimes synonymous with basketball players, and it means that they were literally playing inside of a ring, sometimes not very bigger than a dance floor that was surrounded by a cage. And frequently that cage was used to keep people who were throwing things onto the floor from doing too much damage. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting era, you know. I mean, we can't even imagine how anybody would. Well, we do know. We've seen Russell Westbrook. We've seen Ron Artest react violently to being egged on, literally and figuratively, by fans. So only imagine what it would have been like had they been in this cage and been forced and subjected to people throwing tomatoes and other things at them. But so this league basically started with teams in all the Northeast cities: Boston, Brooklyn, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Washington, D.C., and Detroit. So those are the big teams that are playing. They divide it up into two leagues, and somebody comes up with the genius idea of splitting they play the first champion would be for the half of the league, and then the second champion would be the second half of the league, and then the two winners would play off in the playoffs. So that's how they divided it.
Why do you think, as you look back, why do you think, I can probably guess the economic reason, but why did the Washington Palace Five, as they would know, I think they're also known as the Laundrymen, little story behind that too, right? Why do they only last a handful of years in the 20s, and then sort of dissipate until the Capitals came along almost 20 years later?
Right. Well, Marshall's into everything to make money. He does like to have attention paid to him, and there's kind of this joke about Gorgeous George. And I even referenced, looking at his picture, that he kind of cuts a suave look. He ran a company called the Palace Laundry Dry Cleaning Company in an era when people didn't have washers and dryers in their house, barely had space for rooms to keep their beds. So everybody had to actually use the laundry services, and his was the biggest one in Washington. He took it over from his father, who ran a West Virginia company, and turned it into a mega business. And so with that in mind, he thinks, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to basically improve my stock by linking myself up with popular culture, with a sports team. And they played in a place called the Arcadia, which was, on usual basis, a dance floor. And they played on Wednesdays and Sunday nights, and they drew a pretty good crowd, and then most of the people would stay and dance afterwards. So I think it's kind of interesting to talk about what kind of game we're talking about. You know, there are some references to this game in some box. You try to look at a box score and try to understand what in the world happened, and it really doesn't tell you the whole thing. It just gives you a little snippet that you can possibly even misinterpret. In some of these games, they had 50 fouls. It's grabbing, it's pulling people down, it's very rough and tumble. You're only going to the foul line for a single shot, so you can only score 1 point if you're going to the foul line as opposed to shooting from the outside. And the ball is warped, and they haven't even developed a sense of a set shot yet. So you really had to get in close to score. So there was a lot of mugging. And that's pretty much what the game was like. So it's a very rough and tumble game. And it's interesting that it was a very highly immigrant game. It drew a lot of Italian and Jewish immigrants in the Northeast who were drawn to both the opportunity to play sports, but also the opportunity to make a decent check. I mean, some of these guys are making $800 for playing, and the great ones are making $5,000 to $10,000 in this new league.
It's also a social event, though, too, right? For because of the dance and the sort of component afterwards, right? It was kind of like an event, a social circle, especially for those either ethnic or social club kind of things, right? Where the basketball and dancing and probably some food, and it's a whole night, right? Full of stuff.
Exactly. It's a whole night. And what's interesting about that is, and it kind of puts basketball into context a little bit. I think, especially nowadays, when we look at what the NBA is and the amount of coverage that it gets, I don't think we can even fathom what it was like in the 20s and the 40s and the 50s, where these guys, I mean, I talk a lot. I'm a labor historian by training, and so I'm very focused on what it was like to travel, what it was like, how much your per diem was. These guys, even through the 50s, these men who are 6'6", 6'7", would cram 3 and 4 to a car and drive from Rochester to Fort Wayne to be able to get to a game. So that is so far afield from what we're used to thinking about. And so often the people that went to the game, as you're saying, would use it for an opportunity to cluster around like-minded people or people from their own community. And that continued through the 1940s, where sometimes they had musical acts or some second half of the event so that people could get a full night out of it. As one person said, if I'm going to spend $5 on a date, I don't want it to end by 9 o'clock.
Wink, wink, nod, nod, but,
Yeah. Exactly. So that is pretty much, I mean, that's what the servicemen were thinking when they were coming back and starting to date some of these women in 46 and 47 and 48. They want to have something else. They don't want to, I mean, it's expensive to go to a game, so they want to be there for 3 to 4 hours, and they want to have the opportunity to get to know the person that they're with. and to show them a good time.
Yeah, and I think for what you're also hinting at too is this also essentially connects with the history of the sport professionally too, because around that, I mean, you're describing, for a couple of decades, it's sort of this melange of social activity and the cager thing, and the rules are still relatively the industrial component of it, where people are working by day, playing by night, and the barnstorming and the bus rides and all that kind of stuff. And the ABL for many, many years was, I want to call it ragtag, but it was certainly it was industrial, both pejoratively as well as literally, right? And I think that's kind of probably one of the reasons that a team, if really didn't sort of come about, another professional team, until the late 40s, when both of these fledgling professional leagues were getting going. And it only made sense, I guess, given the early history for DC to get one of those initial pro franchises. I'm just surprised that that the Capitals didn't last more than about 4 or 5 seasons. I get the sense that they kind of went down a rung after they sort of left what was now the NBA. After starting in the BAA, they kind of took a step down and played in they went back down, if you will, to the original ABL and kind of played more of the ragtag version until they fully dissipated a year later.
Right. That's exactly what happened. They were in the NBA for a little while, but they didn't have once they lost Auerbach, they lost the genius, the basketball genius. And that had to do with both play on the court, but also people that you would get. I mean, he had that. And without that, there was nobody strong enough to lead it. And then Bob Ferrick eventually leaves for the safer confines of college basketball. And now they're basically bankrupt, both as a group of players, but also in their leadership. They had a leadership board. I mean, that's something that unfortunately seems to have crippled a lot of Washington basketball franchises. Is a little bit of a brain drain, so to speak, or not getting the right people in the first place. I mean, the other ABL if we want to go a little further, Abe Saperstein decides that he wants to get into the NBA, and the owners won't let him. The guy who owned the Harlem Globetrotters. So he starts a league, the second version of the American Basketball League, in 1961. And Washington joins that as one of the professional team entries. And so, I mean, that's kind of an interesting story in its own right, because this new league is happening at the same time that the AFL is starting in football.
Yeah, and let's put this in context, right? This is about 10 years or so after the NBA had itself been created from out of the loins of the BAA and the NBL. And you also recognize, too, that somebody like Abe Saperstein, right, very involved in, especially in the Philadelphia area, a lot of sort of the early stuff about basketball in its very early days, as we were just describing. So this is a guy who's been around and has been making money, if you will, albeit, in sort of a barnstorming fashion, professionally, right? So if he's not allowed somehow to come into the NBA, and there's various reasons as to why that was the case, he's like, well, maybe I can get a few of my fellow arena owners who feel similarly. Let's challenge the NBA. And there's plenty of more cities that could benefit from professional basketball now that it's becoming a thing. But as you're going to describe in a minute, not only did that not last very long, I think it was officially a season and a half. This franchise, why don't you describe the history of this franchise? Because even though the league only lasted a year and a half, this franchise had an interesting, its own journey within that year and a half.
Harry Lynn, this guy who owns the Washington Coliseum, he bought it off the widow of Mike Uline, decides that, hey, I need some entertainment. And he loses the job that he was doing in Washington, and the family wants to stay in Washington, D.C. So he thinks, I can make money running this business. And so he goes and gets in contact with a man named Paul Cohen, who was running an industrial team called the Tapers. and he gives Cohen basically the reins to stock and start the Washington basketball team. You can imagine, just thinking about this for a minute, you're taking an industrial team as your core players. That's a pretty bad start, in my mind, And so that's what was one of the elements behind this. But I just want to talk a little bit briefly about where Saperstein's business sense is coming from. Television is now bursting out into all kinds of individual homes across the country. I mean, obviously television starts in the 30s, but really becomes a big deal in some of the major eastern cities during the late 1940s. But by the 50s, with shows like I Love Lucy and everything else, it becomes something that everybody's watching. And so televised sports is definitely an opportunity. And the AFL saw that opportunity with football, and Saperstein thought they would have the same opportunity with basketball. What he didn't understand was basketball was nowhere near as popular as football. So he couldn't get that kind of contract, the kind of money that kept the AFL afloat while it was fighting the NFL and while it was offering contracts to players that could seduce them to play for an AFL team. The ABL didn't have that. So basically, it's a kind of interesting story about where the whole idea is coming from. But there were a couple of things that doomed the ABL besides the business aspect of it. One was that they were going to have a franchise in Los Angeles. Now, that would be a huge deal because if you think about it, 1961, there's no team in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles had just gotten the Dodgers in 1958. So in other words, professional sports had woken up to the idea that, yes, there were people that were living out in the West Coast, and they would want to support a team too. And we could get a television market for those big populations also. And it didn't cost as much with jet travel to move your teams around. So it just made it feasible to open up this market. And Saperstein thought he would get his LA Jets into the arena in Los Angeles, and he was outmaneuvered by the leaders of the Minneapolis Lakers and the NBA, which got Minneapolis, which was kind of down on its luck and losing some of its audience and appeal, to move to Los Angeles. And they got the arena, they got the rights to play. So that kind of doomed them there too. But are there some things that you were thinking about that you wanted me to talk about with the Tapers?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Tapers, right? So the Tapers essentially began with the ABL in 1961, but their origin, you were hinting at it before, I don't think we got specifically to it. Their origin was as an amateur team, and they weren't even based in Washington for that. They were based in New York. So how does that all how does that become the genesis or the core of a team in Washington, D.C. in this new league?
Well, Lynn runs out of money and needs money to be able to pay the franchise fee to be able to be in the ABL. And so he goes looking for money, and he finds Paul Cohen, who's the president of what's called the Technical Tape Corporation in New Rochelle. And so he fronts him $100,000 or so to be able to buy in to the rights to have this basketball, to be part of this basketball team. And then since Lynn knows very little about the basketball world, he basically forfeits those decisions over to Cohen. So not a bad deal for $85,000 to $100,000. You inherit basically the decision making of this team. So I think there's a couple of things that stood out for me about that team, which was the fact that Gene Connolly, who was both a professional basketball player, he played with the Celtics, and he also played professional baseball with the Red Sox, played with the Tapers. So he was actually a member of the Tapers in this league for a short period of time. And I spend a little time talking about the rarity of guys who are actually good at multiple sports and became professionals at multiple sports. I don't know if that jumps out at you at all as something to talk about, but I think just for the sake of it, I think it's interesting to note that Dave DeBusschere, was one of them. And then one of my other interesting ones was a guy named Ron Reed, who played both baseball and basketball. And then the most recent one that I can think of, or maybe there's two, the one that sticks in my head because he was still part of the NBA world until last year, was Danny Ainge. Danny Ainge played second base, I think, for the Toronto Blue Jays. And, of course, we all know him as a guard with the Celtics.
Yeah, I doing some research. I think Connolly was even sort of pulled into sort of doing promotional work for the Tuck Tape Company along the way.
That makes sense. I mean, goodness sakes, you've got this asset.
Yeah.
Let's use them for every chance they get.
Well,
I think the most interesting conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so give me a sense though. But the team did not last long in DC because again, we're talking about a team that in the league it only lasted a year and a half. But by the middle of the first season, they moved to New York, the Comac Arena of all places, which is legendarily woeful as the ABA version of the New York Nets found out a number of years later. But then they even moved to. Didn't they move to Philadelphia for the next season, which only became a half season? So, what's the story behind bouncing around there?
Exactly. They were an itinerant basketball team or a group of nomads. Let's call them that, because basically the league itself. I mean, the other downfall of the league is, obviously, you finding stars, finding name players to fill out, to draw the spectators, and then you're traveling. My favorite part of this league is that they actually had a Hawaiian Chiefs team. So could you imagine the cost of the investment, the cost of flying your team out there to Hawaii, and then they play multiple games because they didn't want to fly back until they had played out the time that they were going to play in Hawaii. And so that also ended up drawing little interest from those fans that might have been interested in the first place in Hawaii. But I think the most telling story, I talked to Kaiser, and he basically had very positive memories of the experience. I mean, he joked about being the notable player on the team, i.e. the high scorer, But he actually said he had a really nice time playing. He only meant to play for 3 years as a pro anyway. He came out of Georgia Tech. And so for him, he got a contract that guaranteed him to be paid for 3 years. So he was kind of a happy camper whether the team lasted that long or not. But he told a great story about going out to dinner with some of his African-American teammates at a local diner near the stadium in Northeast near 3rd Street. And they were looking at menus, and the guys were grousing on the other side of the table. The African Americans in particular complaining about how expensive the sandwiches were. And Kaiser looked at the menu that he had in front of him, and he said, "But it's only $4 for a sandwich." And they said, "Double that." And then they actually showed him that they had a second menu. That they got a menu that was given to them that had double the price of all the stuff that Kaiser had gotten because Kaiser was a Caucasian man.
Jeez.
Yeah, so I think that kind of gives you another sense of what some of the African-American players were up against in some of these cities, especially some of the quote-unquote southern cities. And I think this comes to fruition when we talk about Earl Monroe and Earl Monroe as a player with the Baltimore Bullets.
Well, but before we get there, though, I don't want to bury the ABL too quickly because I think in many respects it's also it was ahead of its time, right? From a lot of what Saperstein was thinking, but also from rules innovations, right? The 3-point shot and a 30-second shooting clock and a wider free throw lane. And an envisionment, frankly, again, probably years early, around a growing nation that could be literally a coast-to-coast professional sporting endeavor, and perhaps even including in that this budding thing known as television. But, again, the NBA certainly had a 10-year head start, right? And you were sort of mentioning it earlier before, right? I mean, talking about the NFL and the AFL, right? The AFL in the early 60s made a little bit, perhaps maybe in history's retrospect, right? A little bit more sense because pro football had been more of a thing for a little bit longer period of time. Not so with the professional basketball thing, which was probably about 20 years the NFL's junior.
Right. Exactly. And I think, we talk about what kind of ground was sown for these two different sports. College football, which some of these players were coming out of, that were going into the NFL, was huge. It had an incredible devotion throughout the West, the Midwest, and the South of this country. So there was a built-in audience right there for some of those stars that were moving from the ranks of Alabama to go to become Joe Willie Namath, with the New York Titans / Jets. So there was a bit of an easier sell. College basketball, of course, eventually developed a big cadre, a big fans, but for the most part, especially in the 1950s, and we can talk about the scandals and the betting scandals in the 1950s. A lot of college basketball.
We don't have to talk about that too much in historical perspective because it's coming back again. You just wait, given the professional betting thing that's going on. What could go wrong with that?
This time we hope it's legal.
Right. Well, we'll see about that. The integrity of the game be damned.
Point shaving, among other things. But what's interesting about that is it still was clustered in the Northeast and the Rust Belt, the college game. The Big Ten, basketball, and Long Island and Rhode Island and all those places up in the Northeast. So it wasn't as national as college football. And I think that plays a role in understanding why the ground was a little bit more fertile. So you had stars to sell. And I think what you were hinting at about the changes that Saperstein brought into the game, I think there's a kindred stuff in the AFL. I mean, we talk a little bit about the AFL had an open game, a much more open game, which involved a lot more offense and a lot more throwing than the NFL did. And that's something that could have happened with the ABL. Had it had the chance to grow roots and to sink in, I think those things like the 30-second clock, the three-point shot, may have actually solidified itself. It's hard to say, but it's certainly a possibility. And we see it rise up again with the start of another upshot league in 1967.
All right, what's this? Bet DSI. All right. Well, hey, you're looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? Well, Bet DSI is an industry leader, perhaps even the industry leader in football betting, and is the perfect sports book for both novice and professional bettors alike. At Bet DSI, you can also enjoy live in-game betting. So what's that mean? Well, it means you can not only bet your favorite teams, but you can do that and all kinds of different prop bets and various situations all game long on nearly every play to the final whistle. BetDSI has been around for 20 years and paying winners all along the way. 10,000 and more betting options daily on all the sports you love to watch. Daily fantasy, top ratings on all the betting review sites, you name it. BetDSI is the way to go. They've got a very user-friendly interface and mobile site and has the fastest payouts in the industry. Simply play, you win, and you get paid. Doesn't get better than that. Plus, BetDSI offers betting options for just about everything. NFL, college football, sure, but NBA, NHL, UFC, golf, other sports, politics even, reality TV, esports, virtually everything. Try live betting at BetDSI, and you can bet on every major sport and event through the entire game, every play, and every minute. So, new members, that's what you're here for, right? New members get a 100% bonus match to their deposit when you use the promo code SEATS100. Again, 100% a bonus match when you use promo code SEATS100. That's more than double your money to start winning today. So once again, go to betdsi.com and use the promo code SEATS100 and get this limited time 100% bonus offer and make some extra cash on the sports you know and love. And additionally, if you use Bitcoin, you'll get an additional 100% deposit bonus on your first 2 deposits up to $2,000. It all adds up to BetDSI being the place to do your betting as the football season approaches. It's only a game until you bet it at BetDSI. Thank you, BetDSI, for your sponsorship of this episode. And now, back to our conversation. All right. Well, I don't want to talk about the ABA just yet because I want to use that ABL. The reason why I wanted to circle on the ABL one more sort of rev there was because this is the irony of this entire Washington D.C. basketball story. Because had it not been for the ABL, you could make the argument that the team that now occupies the Washington NBA franchise slot wouldn't have come around, because the beginnings of what this franchise now known as the Wizards was actually got its start in 1961 in Chicago as an expansion team in the NBA as a response to what Saperstein was doing with the ABL. So maybe you can use that as a starting point for, let's say, the beginnings of what is now the Washington Wizards, circa 61 in Chicago.
So that was the Chicago Stags, exactly. And they had 2 major all-stars, a guy named Terry Dissinger and most notably Walter Bellamy at center. And they drafted well, but they started with a rough team, and they did not draw much interest in Chicago, enough interest to sustain itself. And so what happens is they're put on the block, and three men in the Washington area decide to buy it. And that's a guy named Earl Foreman, Abe Saperstein, and their friend, whose name is escaping me right now. Holman, I think his name is. Oh, goodness. Name's escaping me. But they basically come in and say, okay, we're going to take this team and we're going to transplant it to Baltimore. And they play in the Baltimore Coliseum. And they get considered, because they're leftover from the Chicago team, Baltimore ends up playing in the Western Division of the NBA.
So the Chicago Packers, and then they became the Zephyrs. This franchise, right, was essentially bought by these guys and brought to Baltimore and reincarnated in some respects, right? They took on the name the Bullets, which was the name of one of the original BAA NBA franchises, but completely, a number of years differently. And why? I guess the question would be, why would? And Earl Foreman's an interesting character, because we've talked about this at length, about the MISL and the ABA later on. What was it about Baltimore that was going to be better than Chicago in terms of being a big market? Was it because of this sort of head-to-head competition with the ABL that was sort of stirring up there?
It's a good question. We saw, as you point out, the Washington team couldn't sustain an audience, in the ABL. So you would wonder why Baltimore would. But Baltimore had a lot of industry. It was a big manufacturing city, a big port city, and it had an incredible ethnic community. And so it had a built-in audience. And so I think since those gentlemen basically feel that, Earl Foreman in particular, feel that Baltimore could be a successful place for the franchise. And they basically have an audience. They have that built-in audience, and they also have a 12,000 person arena, which in that day is pretty good to be able to bring in to be able to sustain that audience. So I think that's one of the reasons why Baltimore is a good place. They know Baltimore, and there's enough interest and enough money in the city to be able to sustain the team. And it proves that they're, for the most part, they're right. And then they actually do have a pretty good team.
Yeah, it seems like I'm trying to sort of figure out because we'll sort of get through the 60s in a minute, but I get the sense that it was also around the time where the NBA was really kind of starting to get its sea legs in terms of legitimacy and national attention as perhaps as a major sport worthy of follow, as well as players, right? And the Bullets really I think they more than held their own. I mean, they pulled off some pretty decent trades in the 60s. They started to play fairly decently, and then by the end of the decade, I mean, you mentioned one of them, but maybe we should talk about sort of I would argue the two almost crucial members, two Hall of Famers that came aboard in '67 that really kind of helped put Baltimore, the Bullets, on the map and set the tone for what would happen in the decade following.
Right. Ironically, just to talk a little bit about Walter Bellamy, Bellamy becomes one of the first of the many Washington players that holds out in a contract dispute and basically asks for a trade. And so there's a lot of friction on the team. There's people like Bailey Howell, Gus Johnson, who are good players, and Bob Ferry, good players on their own right. And there's questions about Bellamy's desire to pass, Bellamy's scoring, Bellamy playing for his own sense of self-worth as opposed to playing a team game. But the Bullets were good. The Bullets went to the playoffs several times during the mid-1960s. And, you know, it's interesting that you talk a little bit about why Baltimore. And one of the things I want to get back to about that is they're getting local television money. There's interest enough to watch the game on TV. So they sustain themselves, even though they're basically a little bit in the red, they sustain themselves through a local television contract and then whatever they get out of the national NBA contract, which isn't very much. But it's interesting that they're always feeling Baltimore is still feeling a monetary crunch because none of these men, Poland, Hess, or Foreman, are not rich themselves. So they can't sustain a team with too many high contracts. So they basically trade their first All-Star. They trade Walter Bellamy, and they pick up some decent players. And, you know, they play well, but they struggle a little bit with the fact that they were shorter when they lost Bellamy. And this is the league. One could start to argue that, you know, obviously Mike in before this, but this is the era. This is the first era of the great center. Bill Russell, clearly, still playing, still vibrant. Wilt Chamberlain, you know, and so the game focuses around the center. And with Bellamy gone, they lose both the offense that's there, but they also lose some of the defensive strength that they had. So anyway, going on a little bit about the 67 draft, you're talking about Earl Monroe, and we're also talking about Gus Johnson, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Both of whom are, you know, Bellamy's actually a Hall of Famer too. So, I mean, the Bullets had some incredible players, but we get into the whole question about monetary, the amount of money that they had and the distribution of that money, and then playing in Baltimore. Earl of Pearl comes from Louisiana, I believe, if I got that correct. And already, right from the beginning, he doesn't want to play in Baltimore. So he actually gives them a headache right from the beginning. He doesn't see Baltimore as an opportunity from where he can actually branch out his quote-unquote, I know this is using a term that's relevant today and wasn't as relevant then, but to build his own sense of who he is and his brand. So he already wants, he does not want to stay in Baltimore. And so that's one of the initial problems that they have. And then Gus Johnson is considered to be too much of a me player, a little bit of too much of a shooter, and a little bit too moody for some of the guys who played years before and were a little bit more of a team players, guys like Don Ole. So, you know, it's a mixed bag. But Monroe wins Rookie of the Year, and they definitely have an amazing team that goes into the playoffs. and does very well. And really, that's the roots of Bob Ferry quits the team, becomes the team's coach, and that's kind of what we start to see a trend of former players going into coaching positions and general management positions with the Bullets/Wizards. So that's a whole other trend that we can talk about.
Let's also talk about the other sort of guy who is, I would argue, is probably the most synonymous with this franchise, because you're hinting at his roles later in life as well as was Wes Unseld. Yeah. There's probably no better face for this Bullets franchise, both Baltimore and then ultimately when they moved to D.C. Can you sort of explain a little bit about just how integral he was to putting them on the map? Because I think it's lost on a lot of people. And Unseld was part of this.
Well, remember,
Go ahead.
Right. I was talking about the importance of the center position. He's an undersized center. He's only 6'7", going against some of these men who were at least 6'10", and of course Will Chamberlain at over 7 foot. I think Russell's 6'11", right? So anyway, we're talking about an undersized mountain man, a big physical dude. And so, they talk about he's hardcore. He plays the game tough, and he plays the game with elbows. And so that is one of the core things that the Bullets, which eventually became the playoff Bullets and then eventually the championship Bullets, are synonymous with that kind of gritty, determined, physical. I'm gonna beat you. I am going to physically take you and beat you. It's kind of like the joke that we have about current day Novak Djokovic, which Andy Roddick started, which says, first I'm going to take your legs, then I'm going to take your spirit. It's kind of the way Unseld played. That man is hardcore, and he becomes identified with the Bullets as their man. And eventually, as I say, they're coach, they're basically everything. They're general manager. Somebody puts it very well. He says, the image of the Bullets is a losing and lackadaisical organization on the court, and at the box office, all that is over. Starting today, it's going to be a successful organization. And that's what Poland and the other one said when he got his man, when they drafted Wes Unseld. And this is a hell of a lot of pressure to put on a rookie. But, to basically think that he's going to change the franchise.
Hey, let's talk about A. Poland for a second before we go further, because we mentioned Earl Foreman earlier, and he's going to come back in a second when we talk about the ABA and that sort of dalliance. But you want to talk about A. Poland and where his role is in all this, because if Foreman, was kind of at least part of the mix of the three guys. Poland's the guy who really, if you will, steps up and takes it to the next level, certainly as the 1970s start rolling around with Unseld and others.
Correct.
So who's this A. Poland guy? Can you describe for our audience who he is?
So A. Poland is a Washington real estate magnate. That's where he makes his money. And eventually, the friendship that he had with Arnold Haft and Earl Foreman becomes a little bumpy. And they disagreed with each other on the location of the team. And this is brought about by what they consider to be limited fan support in Baltimore. As I'm saying, they had a 12,000 person arena. It usually had 4,000 to 5,000 people in it. And basically they got tired of running get, and they got tired of Poland got tired of his two friends who were constantly in need of money. And so he basically addressed their money need by buying them out. And he buys them out in 1969. And that's also part of the reason why he makes the statement that he does about the end of the lackadaisical organization. Because he considers himself to be... No,
that's interesting. I didn't realize that. And the timing, of course, then also neatly ties up with Foreman then going out and getting an ABA franchise for DC.
Correct. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Before Earl Foreman died, I had the great opportunity to talk to him. And, talk about a devilish genius. I mean, maybe that's an unfair categorization. I don't mean to call him a devil. I'm just saying he has that kind of impish genius that came across in my phone conversation with him.
Yeah, we just for our listeners, we talked to his partner in crime starting up the old Major Indoor Soccer League in the late 70s, and would have Ed Tepper, and we would have loved to have had the opportunity to talk to Foreman specifically about that, because that was itself its own sort of white hot comet. But you can see, right, that sort of devilish sort of approach, right? I mean, whether he was spurned by Poland or whatever, but recognizing that, hey, this ABA thing, maybe this is a way that basketball can, I can run my own show, so to speak.
Exactly. So Poland runs the ship neatly, and basically works on trying to solidify the team itself. And so, I mean, we could talk a little bit about the fact that with Unseld at the center, the team is relatively successful with Monroe, but Monroe basically says, I don't want to play here anymore, and was willing to sit out for an entire year. And that was done by one other player that was notable during that period, a guy who threw underhand from the foul line, a guy by the name of Rick Barry. So he was going to follow, Barry did that in 1967, and he was going to follow, Monroe was possibly following Barry's path. And so that forces the Wizards to make a trade. And they make a trade for a guy named Mike Reardon and Dave Stallworth. And they trade Earl Monroe to the New York Knicks. And then it becomes Earl the Pearl and Walt Clyde Frazier in the backcourt of the only championship Knicks team there has ever been. But I'm sorry, I shouldn't have a perverse. There's something funny about that. The frustration, maybe just thinking about the frustration of New York City basketball fans is enough to make me laugh about that. But back to Washington. So Monroe forces himself out. The guys who come in, although Stallworth did have a drug problem and eventually didn't play as well as he had when he was with New York, Reardon brings in a hardcore, hard-hitting, not a marksman, but a decent shot, and that kind of characterizes the Bullets for the next 3 to 4 years. Hardcore, crunch you on the front line, that kind of identity. And it's interesting because that identity stays with the team even when Unseld leaves them through the 1980s, and we could talk about that later. So that sets Poland eventually sets a path with a couple of good trades and the management of Gene Shue as their coach to the only championships that Washington Bullets had, which was in 1977 against 1978 against the Seattle Supersonics.
All right, well, we'll get to that. That's sort of the crowning thing. I want to sort of maybe sort of end on that note, right? But I just want to step back here again on. So in the late 60s, right, the Bullets are really becoming a thing. I mean, I know they hosted the NBA All-Star Game in ’69. Some pretty good battles with the Knicks even before Monroe going to the Knicks. But now I want to bring back the Earl Foreman and the ABA situation. So maybe a little background on that, because this is actually integral to why I think Baltimore and Poland ultimately chose to move the team from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. Do I have that correct?
Correct. Territorial disputes, it's called.
Right. Well, I'm going to set this up. We had the great pleasure of talking to Pat Boone, one of our early episodes around the Oakland Oaks, right? And so the Oaks were obviously the team that Foreman wound up bringing to D.C. Maybe you could kind of get a little sense as to what Foreman had in mind by trying to find this team and bring him to D.C. when he knew that Poland had the Baltimore Bullets and the territorialness of that region, right? Baltimore, Washington is either separate or a megalopolis, depending on how you look at things. And I have a feeling they both looked at it differently.
Exactly. So as you put it, the Oakland Oaks are a ABA team. The ABA has started in 1967, and it's a wide open offense league to contrast against what they see as a more traditional pick and roll, cut and screen NBA. And it gets into the whole discussion that we just had about the idea that basketball is now starting to establish more national roots. There's a television market for an alternative league that can maybe boost that league for a couple of years while the teams solidify themselves. And so the Oakland Oaks are basically available for sale. And in 1969, Earl Foreman buys them for $2.5 million with a silent business partner. Now, Foreman loved running. Foreman was a lot of the decision-making of the early Baltimore Bullets was made by Foreman. So Foreman definitely had a love for basketball and for running his team. But he knew that he was going to win either way with this purchase. The way he was thinking about this, and he did admit this, was there's territorial rights idea that the Baltimore Bullets, Baltimore's only less than an hour away from Washington, so the mileage is marginal. And the idea around territorial rights is that I have a 100-mile radius around my team, which Baltimore, obviously, if my radius would include Washington, D.C. So basically, the NBA said no basketball team could start up, no professional basketball team could start up within the radius of these territorial rights. And Foreman knowingly starts up a team in Washington, D.C. And guess where he puts them? He puts them in the Washington Coliseum. That was the home of the Washington Tapers. So he basically violates the territorial rights, which he's ready to take to court. He figures, that is not necessarily something that a team can support because there is such a thing as antitrust. And he figured he might be able to win a case on antitrust. But more importantly, he figured they might buy me out. They might buy my team out to get me to move. And so either they'll buy the team outright or they'll give me money to go away. So that was the thinking behind bringing the Washington team here.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize, too, that even in year 3, if you will, or so of the ABA, the rumors of mergers and amalgamation of teams was already underway.
Exactly. And, I mean, there's a lot of articles about that happening. And the expectation is that sooner or later it was going to happen. And so, he had some grounds for thinking this. It made perfect sense. So he hires a guy named Al Bianchi to become the coach of the team. This guy used to play with he was a scrappy former guard with the old NBA in Philadelphia and before that Syracuse. So, he's got some former players, and the most interesting players to me are he has Dave Bing that he brings in, but he also brings in Larry Brown. So Larry Brown is a guard with this Capital team that's playing in the old arena. I think that's kind of fun when you think about the most nomadic person in the history of professional basketball. I would say without a doubt is Larry Brown. So it's kind of interesting that Larry Brown gets tied into this. So the team is basically pretty successful, and it draws decent crowds and, starts winning in the ABA. And he's faced with a suit from Poland to stop playing professional basketball games. And Foreman's not worried about that. He figures he's willing to sustain a loss of $400,000, which in that time, as you think, is basically translating to millions of dollars, just to stay in operation, because he knows that if I've got Rick Barry, if I've got Larry Brown, I've got relative name people, and I can draw a crowd, and I can possibly get television money, or most importantly, they're going to merge. And my team I'm going to have a franchise in the NBA. So that's basically where we're leaving it at this point. Do you have some questions?
So, okay. So, the Oaks had just come off winning the ABA championship, and arguably he had and obviously Rick Barry was not a big fan of having to move and play in DC and stuff. But I'm just curious as to why only the one season. I mean, it seems to me that Poland was starting to make his intentions known, that not only did he want to, continue this, keep this sort of regional world all to himself, but why would Foreman then leave? He moved to Virginia to become the Squires. Why did Foreman give up so quote unquote easily? Was it pressure from Poland? Were
There was pressure from the NBA. The NBA decided that they weren't going to merge right. They weren't ready to merge, and they tried to move Congress to push for forcing a merger, and that didn't happen. And so Poland, though he was talking big about losing 400,000, basically couldn't sustain that. And so the ABA decided to cover the Capitals' losses for the one season. But what would happen for the next season? He talked big, but he didn't necessarily have the cash behind it. So the NBA decided that they would basically, push him out. And so they basically, through the lack of a merger and through pushing through the territorial stuff, they forced Foreman to leave and to go into Virginia and start what was basically a nomadic team throughout Virginia, basically. So that's what he does. And really just, he couldn't sustain himself. He couldn't sustain a team, and they didn't have the merger, so he couldn't make it happen.
Interesting. It almost sounds like collusion between the NBA and the ABA, despite them being essentially rivals, yet also hinting at wanting to merge, or at least lay down their swords, so to speak, so early in the ABA's existence.
I think, to be honest with you, and this, of course, he wouldn't admit this, but I believe they made it worth his while. The NBA made it worth Foreman's while to leave the Washington area. So both not being able to sustain the cost by not counting on the merger was not happening, and in fact, the merger takes another six or 7 years to happen. And the Virginia Squires don't even last that entire time. But, the whole nomadic team playing in Norfolk and playing in Richmond and playing all over the place just to try to sustain itself didn't last. And in fact, that's where the great Dr. J got his start, with the Virginia Squires.
Oh, yeah. Then he got fire sailed to the New York Nets, and then they subsequently fire sailed to the Sixers, and sort of the rest is history. That's right. Well, again, you got to give Foreman more credit, right? I mean, this is a guy that he had a hand in discovering. All right. Well, let's play out the 70s, and maybe this is the way to sort of cul-de-sac this, and I think maybe we'll just wind up at the end with the transition of the name, but the 70s, I think a lot of people kind of really, and I consider myself a decent longtime basketball fan. I guess I didn't realize just how dominant and successful the Washington Bullets were during the decade of the 1970s. But I do want to get around the specifics of Poland moving from Baltimore to DC eventually. In I guess he announced it in 73, in February of 73. And do I have this right?
Correct.
They played a season known as the Capital Bullets to sort of regionalize.
Yep.
That's interesting. I never knew that.
And it was, the base of where the franchise was located was in an area called Landover, Maryland, which will come back to haunt DC fans a couple of decades later. So the Capitol Arena is beloved by a lot of longtime Washingtonians because obviously the basketball team was incredibly successful, drew very well, and was definitely one of those suburban places that had all the amenities, including a great, cool scoreboard, and was the place where the suburban people could get to it easily, as opposed to having to drive downtown and come to either downtown Baltimore or drive downtown to the arena that Uline built all the way back in the 40s. So, I mean, that's part of the love. And then, of course, the other part of it is that was a great place for concerts. And so a lot of people remember being stoned and watching all kinds of shows like the Grateful Dead, among other things. So I got those kinds of conversations when I talked with fans. You can't filter what people say, you know.
But it's clear though. It's clear though by going to Landover and it was very much regionally positioned, right? So that it was relatively easy for a Baltimore trip to go see a game, and obviously for the DC fan as well. So in many respects but Washington though seemed to have a more resonant tone. I'm just curious as to why it was Capitol for just one season. Maybe it was envisioned as being transitional all along. I don't know.
Well, it's also because the area, the building is built near the Capitol Beltway, which is 495, 495. So that's one of the reasons why I took on that name too. That name nobody talks about it as the Capitol Beltway anymore. The most they give it is the Beltway. So it was taking on the name of the location in a way too, of what was near it. So that was part of the reason also. But I mean, it just lasts for 1 year. And I think Bowen, after he really clears out the deck and any wharf smell from Foreman's ABA dreams is gone, he takes on the name Washington. And that's where he's from too. Poland is a Washingtonian. So that makes a lot of sense that he would make his team a Washington team. So, I mean, the Capitol Center goes up. I mean, it's an interesting story about how quickly it goes up, how much it costs. You know, the biggest arena of that era. I mean, all it offered. So, I mean, it's fun, and then we can talk about it later. But interestingly enough, the other thing that's key for Baltimore is they get Elvin Hayes to play as a forward on their team. And it's the combination of Elvin Hayes and Unseld that begins to make the Bullets into the team that they were to become and the franchise of the 70s with the kind of basketball that they played, along with Mike Reardon, who's hard, and also, ironically, the guy who actually serves as the announcer for many, many years later, a guy by the name of Phil Chenier. That goes back to that whole idea of once you become part of the Wizards family, and I think Poland really thought about this team as a family. Once you became part of the Wizards family, you stayed part of the Wizards family. And so we see the recycling of some of these people as coaches. Kevin Lockerty, who played guard for the Bullets, you know, and it's an interesting phenomena. And of course, that in itself, Bob Ferry, who played with the Bullets in Baltimore in the 1960s, is the general manager of the team for 20 years, from early 1970 through 1990. That's how loyal Poland is.
Yeah, and Wes Unseld, the ultimate example of that too, when he came back to coach in the late 80s.
Right, exactly. And it doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter what you do. That's okay. You're my guy. So I mean, that's kind of the environment that the Bullets and eventually the Wizards are run under, and it kind of undercuts things. But if we have a future time to talk about that, the Wizards conversation and some of the people are fascinating. I'll just give you one little blip. Two men talked to me and they identified what it was like to travel under the early 90s and how it compared with other teams. And then they also identified some of the trading ideas that were bad for the team during the 1990s. And they literally asked me not to quote them. And the reason is that it's such a fraternity. The professional league is such a fraternity that they didn't want to have their name attached to any kind of negative comment about anybody in the fraternity or things that happened in the fraternity, because that would cheat them out of any opportunity to come back into the fraternity.
Interesting. And it speaks to sort of the, I don't know, familial sort of nature of this. I mean, this does harken a little bit almost like to the Jerry Buss dynamic with the Lakers, right? It's kind of like a family run and somewhat close knit, and try not to air the laundry outside the organization. And, you know, 1978, I mean, they brought that, not only the winning that championship, but I mean, they really brought DC to, I mean, it was the first professional championship in some 30 years or so. And that halo, I think, really helped them through the 70s and 80s and even to the 90s. At least sort of that heritage didn't hurt.
Exactly. Plus, they lost the next year in 7 games.
Yeah,
so
they almost made
6
it again.
games. I'm sorry. Yeah, so they had 2 great years in which they rose to the level of playing in the NBA Finals. And of course, it happens to be the years that the league becomes marred with the beginnings of the drug crisis and the use of not talking about marijuana, we're talking about cocaine and speed and other kinds of drugs. So the league unfortunately gets marred a little bit, and it kind of tarnishes those championships in some ways, because when the classic statement, and I'm going to look for this, but the classic statement is, when were the games played? You know, they were talking about the national television rights, which CBS had at that time. And the comment was, CBS played them at 11:30 on tape delay. That's the comment about the finals of the National Basketball Association in that era, that they were played on tape delay and they were shown late at night. And I think that's partly because of the 2 teams that are playing. I hate to say that, but the markets for both Seattle and Washington are not huge. They're not New York. They're not Chicago. They're not Los Angeles.
Yeah, Portland and Phoenix. Portland and Phoenix at that time too. Also, were same kind of dynamic, right?
That's where I was going. The year before, even with Bill Walton, the years before, Portland was playing, and so it hurt the game. And I'm not going to say, I can't prove this, and obviously there's been a lot of discussion about this, but Larry Bird's drafting by the renowned franchise, the Boston Celtics, and Magic Johnson going to the Los Angeles Lakers, and then the way the game is shifted, the development of the three-point shot, all those things actually feeds into the growing of the game. And I think we cannot minimize the role of David Stern.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. We could go wax philosophic about all of that stuff because there's so much there. I don't disagree for sure. I think it's a really interesting commentary there because I remember watching those games in the 70s, right? And they were these tape delay things, and it was it was almost kind of, I want to say mystical. I grew up in the New York area, but it was kind of like an oddity, right? In that there was this NBA championship thing. I was certainly aware of the Nets and the Knicks, but to actually, it was seemingly brushed aside. Now, again, the television landscape was very different. It was only 3 major networks, and cable was only in its very, very infancy. But I guess I just want to sort of maybe use this as our sort of our off ramp.
Can I add one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I add one more thing? I'm sorry. I think we also have to take into account the presence of the African American player and its role in both the popularity and the lack of popularity. There were times when teams basically didn't quite talk about it, but had a minimum and a maximum number of Caucasian and African American players. there was this belief that that was important for the marketing and selling of the game. And I think during the era that we're talking about, except for Bill Walton and a few other people, we are talking about an era in which the game's greatest players and best figures are mostly African American. And I don't know how that affects the audience, but there's this belief that it hampered some of the interest that people might have had in the sport. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't have documentation for that, but I do have documentation for the fact that teams definitely minimize the number of players.
Well, I do want to get into sort of the end story of the Bullets name for the franchise. So we kind of obsess about on this show, previous incarnations of teams, right? So in many respects, the Washington Bullets, right, to me is a past tense kind of thing, and the name change isn't insignificant. But maybe you can maybe we can sort of end our chat here and then get into maybe a little look into the future of where the basketball in DC sort of in your mind sort of sits. But why the name change, and in particular, I guess the rationale around when? I guess this was about the mid 1990s or so. The Bullets name was never sort of originally envisioned as, I guess it was sort of it was connoted to sort of alluding to being quote unquote faster than a speeding bullet, a fast moving team and play and all that kind of stuff. Train, there you go. But it was not, that was not the sensibility in the mid 90s.
Exactly. And what happened is, again, we talk about Poland as a fascinating man. Again, somebody who died before I had the opportunity to talk to him. But enough of a genuine, sensitive family man that when Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated after the Oslo Accords in 1994, he personally felt that the connotations of bullets, in particular bullets as related to weaponry, was something he couldn't live with anymore. And so they held a contest in which they tried to ask their fans to name the team. And the name has an alliteratory notion, the idea of Washington Wizards, WW. And so that might have been one of the reasons why it was chosen. But there was an awful lot of people that weren't happy with that. They couldn't understand for the life of them what Wizards has to do with Washington. But it was chosen. And so that's what it became. And then all the work that goes into marketing the new team with the new logo and, the new start, the new way of being, and cleaning, in a sense, almost like cleaning up a reputation that wasn't negative to begin with, but in his mind was, because of the negative use of weapons and bullets in particular. Also, we have to take into account that in the 1980s, along with Detroit, Washington was one of the murder capitals of the United States. The untoward dealing of crack cocaine and the business of dealing of crack cocaine destroyed neighborhoods. In particular, one neighborhood that's called Hanover, that is 4 blocks away from where I'm sitting right now, in a neighborhood called Truxton Circle. And the street fights and all the drive-bys, it was synonymous with the city. And that also informed Poland, although he didn't really talk about that very much, but it certainly had the man's sensitive, and the man's sensitive in I think, a very genuine way. I don't think this has anything to do with crass marketing or trying to re-envision themselves. I think it really has to do with awareness of the loss of his friend and what was happening to the city that he grew up in and he loved.
Yeah, and Look, and that's only become more pronounced, right? And ironically, in Washington, D.C., with the Washington football team, right, for different reasons, there's more of an evolved understanding of things. And, in retrospect, I don't think you can blame the guy for wanting to change the image of the team, perceived or otherwise, right? That said, however, right, I guess I'll ask two sort of last questions. The first one is, so how much or how little that you're aware of does, and I just don't know the answer to this, does the Wizards franchise now under the ownership of Ted Leonsis and Monumental Sports and a very vibrant ownership group, how much do they go back into the history vault and remember the Bullets version of the franchise, Baltimore or DC versions, or is that literally not? That's sort of just not touched upon at all, really, historically.
Not, for the most part, not touched upon, certainly not touched upon enough. However, there was a mural outside of the front entrance, side entrance, we'll call it. The new arena, which Abe Poland built, what was called the MCI Arena at that time, and now it's the Capital One Arena, I think, runs from an entire city block from G Street down to F Street and from 7th Street to 6th Street. So it's one big giant block. And there's an entrance, a main entrance on F Street, and there's a main entrance on 7th Street. And the 7th Street entrance had a beautiful mural of some of the great players of the past, including the championship team, including guys like Bobby Dandridge, who was a forward and a very important shooter in the 1978-79 era, Wes Unseld, and other notables from the Wizards' past. From the Bullets' past. So there is that. And then there's occasional times when you see somebody being observed for a birthday and those kinds of stuff, but it's not done as much as there could be the opportunity to do. Since it started in 1962, that's a long amount of history, 50 years.
Yeah, but it's delicate too, right? Look, this is also not as violent, so to speak, as moving from one city to another and then completely whitewashing, say, like the Carolina Hurricanes with the Hartford Whalers in the NHL. Yet, conveniently, with new ownership there in Carolina, right, they actually do want to embrace the Hartford Whalers, right? So it just seems to ebb and flow. There's a delicacy to it, or a delicateness. Sorry, that's the correct word. That's not a delicacy. It's not a fine food. Let's get your words right, Mr. English major here. But there's a delicateness, right, to all of this, right? Because it was a sensitive issue and topic and rebranding. Yet it's hard to ignore, right? Like, for example, the 1978 championship season, right, which was arguably one of the most important elements of the historical story of this franchise, right, was as the Washington Bullets, right? So what do? Do you whitewash those out from the video? It just doesn't, how do you celebrate something like that and remember it and anniversaryize it, yet not sort of recognize the fact that it was known as a different name?
Right. And in some cases, obviously a different location, as you were talking about before, whether it was, it was Washington suburbs or even before that in Baltimore itself. So, and Chicago, as we talked about. So but there is a way in which you can tap into the positive aspects of things. And if you put the pictures up and the visuals are strong enough, I don't know that anybody's going to worry about some of the small nuances that we're talking about. I think you could positively sell the emotional message, and that would overtake a lot of the mental gymnastics that we're talking about.
Yeah, or at least explain the backstory, right? Like, that, which is different. Like, and we talked about this with Rich King. We talked about the Washington football team and the name and all the issues around that. I think, and there are a lot of Indian related names that are now being seriously questioned and or revisited and or frankly dropped in favor of other things. But if I remember that conversation correctly, he pointed out that there have been some teams, I think that the Florida State Seminoles, for example, in the NCAA, right, where, they bent over backwards to create an important and historically correct narrative around the importance and the sanctity of that name, the Seminoles, to essentially ensure both in the past in terms of its intent and in the future of how it's used is more of a commemoration and celebration, right? Whereas you look at a team like the Washington football team's former name, it's very hard to defend that before, during, or after. There's really very little that was sort of positive about that nickname, right? So, this could be, and I think this situation, this Bullets name, right, is even less intense than that because there's no offensiveness intended nor incurred, right, by anybody. But the sensitivity certainly could be understood, embraced, and rolled up into, again, I'm not saying, hey, let's sell some Bullets jerseys, right? I also feel it's hard to completely ignore, the franchise's name, and hell, even the fact that it existed in Baltimore. Hell, even I didn't, until this conversation, I didn't even know they were essentially born in Chicago, right? So that history to me is, and again, we obsess about that. We may be the only ones that obsess about this, but it's part of the story, right? And there's generations of fans who don't even know from the Bullets, right? That this Washington Wizards franchise, which is fine, but it's naive to think that it just showed up one day just because you became conscious of it, right? There are years of history that got it to this point, and isn't it curious? And would you like to know and understand that? That's why we do this silly little show.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring it up, and I'm glad you actually have this show. But I do want to point out that there's a North American sports history group, and it's academics that are interested in sports history and write about various aspects of sports history. And so a lot of those guys rescue old leagues like the American Conference, where the Cleveland Browns and the San Francisco 49ers started. And they talk a lot about that stuff. But what I find interesting is the amount of attention that basketball gets from those guys is not that great. It's just an observation. Now, there's plenty of Canadians that spend a lot of time focused on the NHL, and that, more power to them. That's great. I wish more Americans were fascinated with the NHL. But I find it interesting that among the academics, maybe it's an age thing, I don't know, but baseball and to some degree football, and really the biggest thing that gets the most attention is the Olympics. I don't know. That's just something that I've experienced, and I thought you might find that interesting. That even the people that study this stuff don't necessarily focus on basketball and don't necessarily focus on the various iterations.
Well, hopefully we'll get a few more people from the group to listen to the show. Maybe we'll stir some stuff up. All right, here's the last question then. So I kind of hinted at it. You sort of showed my bias a little bit, but I get the sense that the Wizards are essentially in good hands as the NBA goes to sort of stratospheric levels now. I mean, on a good day, given the NFL a run for being an international dominant factor in the sport, Messrs. Leonsis and crew, and the Monumental Sports Group, it would seem to me that the Wizards are in solid shape to not only continue in the DC area, but be an influencer in the NBA and onwards.
Well, okay, that's interesting. We didn't talk a little bit about perception. Even back to early 1990s, some players, Brian, there are a few players that actually, Brian Shaw, for example, refused to come here, didn't want to come to Washington. And so that's something that the Washington franchise still has to fight. There's just something about this city that, even though his agent at that point talked about it's one of the greatest places to be an African-American professional young single person. And that didn't sell him. And that continued on for years and years and years. Part of it is being mitigated by the fact that Leonsis spends more money on the team. But there's still that factor. And it's kind of an interesting thing. It's not one of the go-to places. And I have heard interesting stories from some African-American friends that it's a great place for groupies. That players can have an amazing time. And in fact, some of them suppose that it influences their play to a negative extent. But that's hearsay. But I am going to put it out that I'm hoping that with Grunfeld replaced over the last 2 years, we've seen positive moves by the leadership, the general managers. And so I'm hoping that we will reach a new level. We will raise above the team that makes it to the first or if at most second rung, like we did when we played against Boston when John Wall and Bradley Beal were at the top of their game. But that was a one-off, Washington hasn't had that much more than just the one-off. And that's kind of frustrating. And it won't allow the team to build the kind of fan space and momentum. You need multiple years of winning. It's got to become a consistent, positive force in the environment to get to bring people in. So maybe that's what's going to happen. I think the Russell Westbrook trade was a great trade for the Wizards. I'm sorry.
There you go. Bullets, Wizards. Yeah, it's still there, right? It's still there for a generation for sure, right?
It is.
All right, fun stuff. Get the book, will you? It's called The Bullets, the Wizards, and Washington, D.C. Basketball. And I think the title is a tad bit of a misnomer because literally it's a walk through the history of professional basketball, all the major teams that played in the city and environs, including all the lead-ups, including the Baltimore situation and, the diaspora of it from the ABA and the Virginia Squires, all that stuff. And literally, it's a chapter-by-chapter assessment of these various teams, dating all the way back, as we talked about, to the Palace Five, all the way through what is now known as the Washington Wizards and everything in between. It is co-authored by our guest this week, Brett Abrams. Thank you, Brett. And Raphael Mazzone, who was going to join us as well, but pulled up lame just before our recording. So we apologize for not having Raphael here, but I'm sure both of them will overlook that situation by enjoying, hopefully, a couple of purchases of their fine book. It is published by Scarecrow Press. It is available wherever good books are found. And, of course, you can find a convenient link to it at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 232 with Brett Abrams, and you will find a convenient link. It will take you to Amazon. You will get it as quickly as humanly possible. And we'll get a couple of pierogies or shekels or pennies of whatever the demarcation is of love for doing so. And we appreciate you buying all of your books from all of our guests through those links on our website. We appreciate that to no end. We appreciate your email, of course. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We appreciate you following us on social media. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find a page devoted to us on Facebook as well. And what else? Oh, yeah, you can sign up for our email newsletter. Just find the link on our website. Forgot exactly where that is, but you'll find it. Just search around, give us your name and your email address, and voila, you will be informed each and every week. A little head start as to what our topic is going to be each and every week. Want to also thank the kind knob twiddling from our pal Jerry Payne down in suburban Atlanta. Thank you, kind sir, for putting up with us this week, as you do every week. But more urgently this week. We appreciate it. We did not make it easy for you this week. We apologize. But we also want to encourage you to continue to listen. We have lots of great episodes. Also want to make a reference to the clip at the beginning of the show, which I forgot to mention at the top, was from the 1978 NBA Finals, Game 7. And, of course, that was a young and eager Brent Musburger calling the action. And it was, I think that game was tape delayed. I don't know if they made a special arrangement for Washington, D.C. fans, but that's how games were kind of delivered, especially the finals. It was 11:30 at night on the East Coast on CBS. And to let you out here, we're going to leave you with a little gem of a discovery I found on YouTube. If you're a Washington Bullets fan from the 1970s, and you remember that 1978 NBA World Championship, well, you may remember a little tune done by the great Niels Lofgren. Yes, he of the Bruce Springsteen E Street Band and other great musical places and a sterling solo career, too. Niels Lofgren wrote and sang this song we're going to leave you with. It's called Bullets Fever. This is a single that came out, and it was all the rage in 1978. And we're going to leave you with it. Here it is, Bullets Fever, Niels Lofgren. Thanks for listening this week, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bullets fever happens to me every year. Bullets fever, and this year's the one. Bullets fever, got the doctor and the Iceman. Bullets fever, Seattle was stunned. You gotta be a fan from old DC to know what the bullets mean to me. To see them get up and go all the way. For me, Bullets fever is here to stay. Bullets fever happens to me every year. Bullets fever, and this year's the one. Bullets fever, got the doctor and the Iceman. Bullets fever, Seattle was stunned. CJ and Larry, Greg, Joe and Mitch ran the bomb squad into a ditch. CJ, Tom, and Larry are fast as light. Kevin, Bobby, and Eldon, they shoot out of sight. Ain't it beautiful how Bobby D plays so great with a big E? At Ainge Zoo, we blew the Sonics out. Now all the world knows what our team's about. Bullets fever happens to me every year. Bullets fever, and this year's the one. Bullets fever, got the doctor and the Iceman. Bullets fever, Seattle was stunned. With all his heart, West fought the West. Now every bullet where the champions ring. They've got our town screaming and stomping. They've turned it into a family thing. Come on, Coach Matter, king of basketball chess. Come on now, fans, support him every test now. Bullets fever, oh, bullets fever happens to me every year. Bullets fever, and this year's the one. Bullets fever.